Happy New Year to everybody. Tonight our speaker is Dr. David Fleming. David is associated with UL, and David is going to talk to us about the mass rock myth and reality. It's something we've all familiar with, is the topic of mass rocks, but most of us, if in our heads it's in folklore, or if we're trying to find a mass rock in an area, it's very, very difficult. So hopefully David will be able to give us some interesting insights into that aspect of history. So sit back and relax. David, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mary. Firstly, thank you for the invitation, and it's lovely to see so many of you come out. As Mary said, we might have grown up with stories of mass rocks, and there might indeed be an image in your mind of what the mass rock might have looked like, or the scene. And it could be something like this. The typical scene: snow. Is there snow? There is no snow in that one, but it's wintry. Look at the tree there in the back. There's no leaves on it, and the scene is secluded, hidden. Why was it hidden? Anybody know why mass had to be said in secret? The penal laws, and the typical story is that the law of the land meant you couldn't say mass, or the mass was forbidden. It was illegal. And it was the other part of it might have been it was illegal to build the chapel or the church. This might be all part of the story. And that if the priest was caught, he might be, because the priests were illegal, is the way the story goes, then they could be arrested, or worse, martyred for the faith. And I was intrigued by this story, by these stories. I grew up with all of these as well, and I'm an 18th century historian, and when you said the penal laws, that would be something I'm familiar with, because I am a historian of the 18th century, and most of those penal laws were passed in the 18th century, from the 1690s onwards, after the Battle of the Boyne. And so I was intrigued to find these laws. I wanted to find these laws, and I wanted to see if we could establish in the records what the story was about mass rocks. And hence why I'm here tonight, because I did find some things, and then I didn't find a lot of other things. And really the story is a story, especially in this part of the world, in Tipperary, is not so much a story of mass rocks in the 18th century. It's a very different story, which I'll come to. So this is one of the images, and I have another image as well coming up. But anyway, was the mass illegal in the 18th century? Was there a law? And it's fairly straightforward to find a law, because laws are kept, they're documented, they're printed. And I searched the entire statute book, and there was no law which says the mass was illegal in the 18th century, which was surprising to me. I thought, that surely must be right. There were laws from 200 years before that, from the Reformation period, which you'd expect. Reformation is introduced. They want people, the authorities want people to go to the Reformed Church. And at the very beginning of the Reformation, it was a bit funny. Catholic bishops might also be the Protestant bishop for a time. The Catholic Church might be the Protestant Church. And so people might have been a little bit confused. Anyway, that original law, as we know in this country, wasn't very successful. The mass continued to be said by priests and so on. And that's really why the Protestant Reformation didn't really take off in this country in the way that it would have in other countries where the Reformed religion dominated. Were priests illegal in the 18th century? Was there a law which says priests were not allowed in this country? Yes and no. the people who were banished, and I have to be careful because there's a priest in the audience here. Bishops were banned. A law was passed in 1697 which banished bishops and regular clergy. Now, regular clergy are those who follow a religious rule. Regulare, the Latin for rule. So if I'm a Benedictine or a Franciscan, I'm also to be banished. I have to leave the country by a certain date. And we know that various bishops, a couple of them, some stay, some go, the ones that are left. And we know that a lot of the religious orders do also leave for a short period, and then they start coming back. What about the parish priests, the secular priests, the people looking after parishes? Well, there is no law which prevented them. There was a law which required them to register. They would have to go to the magistrate and say, my name is Father such and such. And they had to have two people stand security for them to vouch for them that they were of good standing and that they were who they were. So in a way, the law recognized and permitted the existence of the secular clergy. So the priests themselves were not illegal. The secular priests, the parish priests, the curates. So that was another eye-opener for me. And then the question was, well, what about chapels and churches? And it's the word with the Catholics and Protestants tended not to use the word church. The only official church, according to the state, was the parish church, which was the Church of Ireland. So if you're a Presbyterian, or if you're a Catholic, if you're a Presbyterian, you have a meeting house. If you're a Catholic, you have a chapel. Sometimes the word mass house is used. And in some cases, there are mass rocks. But was it forbidden to build chapels? And that picture would suggest, well, why are they saying mass outside, or hearing mass outside? And again, I could not find a law, any clause in a law, which says, no, Catholics can't build chapels, which was also a bit surprising. And I started digging a bit further. And this is what I want to talk to you about this evening. We don't know a great deal about Catholic religious practice in the 18th century. We know bits and pieces. Nobody was writing down what prayers they were saying at home or what saints they were praying to too much, because most of the population were illiterate. The vast majority of the Catholic population were illiterate. So we don't have a lot to go on, but we do have one very important source, which was a report commissioned by the state in 1731. Report on the state of popery. And the friars were there, and the Benedictines, and even the Jesuits. There were a handful of Jesuits in the 18th century in Ireland, in most of the big cities. And it appeared to the state, well, we have these laws, they haven't worked. What's going on? And like most of the reports, we get an awful lot of information. And so this 1731 report looked at a few different things. It wanted to know where religious services, where they were being held. Was Mass being held in private, in people's houses? Were they being held at what I call open air sites, outside in the open, mass rocks, in other words? Whether they were held in chapels, or where were they held? They were also interested in the number of friars. They weren't supposed to be in the country. They were interested in their numbers, how many were in each parish. They were interested in schools, and they were interested in convents. And the Houses of Parliament in Dublin, House of Lords in particular, asked the bishops of the Church of Ireland to conduct a survey of all the dioceses in the country. on all the civil parishes. The civil parish being the state's parish, sometimes coterminous or the same as the Catholic parish, sometimes a bit different. And we have this report. Now, we don't have the report. We do and we don't. Because about 100 years ago, most of our records went boom, and the original report was lost. But we do have a transcript of that report. Some historian went in about 1912, 1913, just very lucky for this purposes, and transcribed the whole lot. And that reveals a very interesting story. I've mapped it. I took the report. It's quite substantial. It goes through every parish. For the diocese that returned information, not every diocese returned. You see Kerry there, Diocese of Ardfert, Ahabo. That bishop, that Church of Ireland bishop, I think was missing, hadn't been appointed or something, and so there's no information. Happily for Tipperary, for Cashel and Emily, the Diocese of Cashel and Emily, we have a fair bit of information. And what this gives us is a snapshot of Ireland in 1731 in terms of Catholicism and Catholic religious practice and kind of Catholic architecture, I would say. And if you look, it divides, this map is showing, let me tell you what it's showing. The black and white lines there, the horizontal lines, shows parishes where there was a chapel in 1731. If you have very good eyesight, you might be able to see it. The dots, the sort of the grey dots, mostly up into the north of the country, shows where there was no chapel and Mass was being said outside. Right? And the grey is the grey without any dots. That's the report was returned, but they said nothing about those parishes. We neither know one or the other. But I would say it's very likely, in this case, in Ulster, that Mass is being said outside as well. So, you could draw nearly a line there, and you could say that Ulster is particularly noted for an absence of chapels. There are a few places with chapels. Those grey, South Donegal is an example of where there's a few chapels. But by and large, there are no chapels in Ulster in 1731. What's happening down here in Tipperary, Diocese of Cashel and Emily? Chapels. Lots of them. I can tell you not exactly where they are, but I can tell you the parishes they were in and how many priests were there. I can tell you overall in the country that there were 841 chapels. There were 50 friaries, monasteries, friaries, and the Franciscans were big in the country. And there were, wait for it, just 7 convents. So not a lot of convents. But there were 97 parishes where Mass is definitely being said outside. But unfortunately, in 1731, fortunately or unfortunately, it depends on the way you view this, none of them in this part of the world. Now, there are a few grey. You can see there the borders of Limerick and Tipperary. There's a bits of grey there, and where no information, we just don't know. And maybe whoever is providing the information didn't know. By the way, it does reveal that the Church of Ireland knew very well who their opposite numbers were. If it was a minister, that by and large they knew who the parish priest and his curates were. So there is a lot of so it's not a hidden church. This is not a hidden church. It's a very visible church. And you're now wondering, but I grew up with all these Mass rocks. Like, where is the Mass rock? And somebody was telling me, Devil's Bit, there's a Mass rock up there. Well, you're going to have to wait until the end, and I will come back to those and try to explain why those exist as well. I want to maybe explain this situation up in Ulster. And why the difference? Why are there chapels in one place and not in the other? We have a contemporary source which says, from a bishop, who says, was talking about chapels, Catholic chapels, what he called mass houses. Some mass houses, and this is, I suppose, 1750 now this man is talking, writing about this. Some mass houses are kept in repair and adorned, statues, so on, pictures. Others, ruinous, in ruins, according to the wealth or poverty of the popish inhabitants of each parish. And that is the most important point. Economic means. If your parish was a wealthy parish, like Thurles here, I'm sure is a wealthy parish. If you have a parish and you have shopkeepers and big farmers and so on, they can afford to contribute to the building of a church. But if you're up there in Fermanagh, Tyrone, where the Catholic population is smaller, could be 50% of the entire population in some places, or even smaller if you go into Armagh and down, and it's a much poorer population, then you can't afford to build a church. Or if you can afford it, it's going to be a very humble structure altogether. And the example I give of that is, there's the Waterford Church, built much later, 1793, and it's the Catholic Church. It's now the cathedral in Waterford. Same architect who designed the Protestant one did this one in the 1790s. That's ecumenism. That's wealth, and it's Waterford's merchants, and it's middle classes and its professionals. The big cities can afford these structures, but the countryside can't. Digress for a second. I want to tell you a bit about the conditions, but just the hidden nature, question mark, of Catholicism. This is Lough Derg in County Donegal, and I found it on a map from 1714, a military map, a map of Ireland, showing barracks and post offices and everything. And up in the top corner is a little window, a little box with this illustration of Lough Derg in County Donegal, the Diocese of Raphoe. And it's a church, and around it you have, I presume, maybe dormitories or whatever, the places where pilgrims, and of course Lough Derg, like it is today, is and was then, and had been from the medieval period, one of the most popular pilgrimage sites in Ireland. And I think people are curious about it, and I think whoever made this map was curious about, well, all these people are going up. And so he I'm presuming it's he mapped it. And he explained, you'll see the letters there, you'll explain the beds that the pilgrims would perform their various stations at. And I think my slide is messed up, but you can see the words there explaining these various rituals that were done. Not a hidden church. This is 1714, quite visible, mapped for the whole world to see. Evidence too of a pretty substantial T-shaped chapel or church on Lough Derg. And if I was the parish I don't know how it was administered in the 18th century, but presumably there is a priest. You'd be doing very well in terms of your income from all these pilgrims. Interestingly, if you're not in the lake and you're in the parish around the lake, you've no church. In 1731, you're attending Mass in the open, probably, or in people's houses. And before we move on from Donegal, I just want the only description of a Mass rock and Mass being performed at a Mass rock that I have found is from the 1750s and from Donegal, and it's worth 1750s. It's worth just reading it out for you. It's the middle of summer, 19th of July, 1752. The Protestant bishop is coming from his service, probably going off to lunch somewhere along the coast road, around Dunfanaghy. Don't know if you know Donegal, but this is Dunfanaghy. And he had done his service, and he's going wherever he's going. And this is what he said: "I observed a circumstance which added to the romantic view of the mountains to the south. In the side of one of them, a sort of amphitheatre is formed in the rock. Here I saw several hundred people spread all over that plain spot, the priest celebrating Mass under the rock, on an altar made of loose stones." We might all think that a Mass rock is a single rock. Well, up in Donegal, loose stones put together. "And though it was half a mile distant, I observed his pontifical vestment with a black cross on it, for in all this country, i.e. Donegal, for 60 miles west and south as far as Connacht, they celebrate in the open air, in the fields or on the mountains." It's a lovely description of it, and one of the few that we have of Mass being said in the open air, and that's 1752, 20 years after the 1731 report. But even in Donegal, by the end of the century, another visitor was reporting that, well, we're seeing churches now being built. Even in those poorer places, churches were being established. If you were a wealthy person, you might have Mass said in your own house. There indeed might have been a room set aside if you were very well off. But most of the chapels, and probably the chapels in Tipperary, fairly humble buildings. In the Diocese of Clyne, it was noted in 1731, they were called mean thatched cabins. Many or most of them open at one end. Imagine a cabin and imagine the gable end removed. Imagine the priest at the other gable, facing the gable. Imagine some of the more well-to-do parishioners inside the chapel, this cabin-like structure, and then imagine most of the parishioners outside. And I think you'll get a sense of what Mass was like. And in a way, I don't know about whether it was the same in Thurles, but in Kilbenny, County Limerick, not too far away, my grandfather always stood at the back and never sat down. My mother sort of continued that. She sat down in the back pew, but her mother-in-law was always located near the top. And I thought, and I didn't know why this was the case, but I think it's probably to do maybe with their view of where they should be seated and the social hierarchy and all that. At the opposite end of the spectrum, we've seen that church in there in Waterford. In Shandon, in the suburbs of Cork City, St. Mary's Catholic Church was built in the shadow of the Protestant St. Anne's Church of Ireland. So cheek by jowl. There's a one from the north of Ireland. And that Cork Chapel was widely known as the cathedral. And here in the big towns and the cities, when you had that sort of thing happening with Catholic and Protestant churches so close together, you had there for Catholics really testing the limits of toleration. Sometimes it worked, and sometimes the chapels were allowed, and sometimes it wasn't. In Cloyne, which is the seat of the Bishop of Cloyne, and at Charleville, it wasn't allowed, and the chapels were removed. They were told, off with ye, build somewhere else. It's too close to the Protestant church. But in Emily, which is this diocese, isn't it? The Catholic Church and the Protestant Church were side by side, and it was allowed to be there and to continue. And many chapels built after 1714, according to this report, were what they call large and pompous buildings. Pompous, i.e. decorated. So that suggests wealth in certain, and that some of them were slated. This is the more humble one, and it's a very rare, it's a photograph from the 19th century, late 19th century, but you can see how humble it actually is. Apart from the window there in the front, I don't think you'd be able to distinguish it from any other place, from any other cabin or cottage. In Kilteely, do we have anybody from Kilteely? Mass was said in, quote, miserably poor cabins removed from place to place. So Mass would be said one Sunday in one person's cabin or cottage, house. The next time it would be said someplace else. And if you're familiar with the station Masses, this could be maybe one of the origin stories of those stations. You move from station to station or place to place. In the large and mountainous parts of Healy-Ray country and West Cork, there were just huts, a hut for the priest, and open at one end, and that was to give the priest some shelter. In some cases, Mass, when it is being said in the open air, when there's no shelter at all, it is being said in monastic ruins, which shouldn't be too surprising. You know, a monastery is a sacred place, a holy place. Indeed, the graveyards are there as well. Priests, people would assemble there. It made sense. Also, ring forts. I've wondered about ring forts. We know that ring forts are used sometimes for burials of babies and so on. But I was thinking, these places are known, and so, you know, not many people might know Christie's Field, Christy O'Brien's Field, you know, which is Christy O'Brien's Field, but they might know, oh, the ring fort on Christy O'Brien's Field, we'll meet there. So sometimes these are locations that are well known. What else do I have to? This is an example of Limerick, of the various churches in Limerick. You'll see on the left, it's not a great photograph, of the 18th century church and the current church, St. Munchin's. This is St. Munchin's. The photograph is taken from King John's Castle, which is the location of the army barracks in the 18th century. So again, this is not a hidden church. This is a very visible church. The chapel is there under the noses of the corporation and the army. And this is a reason as well. This photograph nicely illustrates the point that most 18th century mass houses or chapels do not survive. Why do they not survive? They don't survive because the population after 1750 increases dramatically. And the chapels that are there, number one, are not in a good state. And number two, if they are there at all, like this one, they're too small by the time you get to the 19th century. And so in the 19th century, there's a massive program of chapel building. And that's when many of our great Catholic churches are built. And they're double the size. You can see it there, the difference in size. Sometimes these penal chapels are turned into schools, and they can survive that way. Most of the time, they're demolished, and the site is used to build the newer church, the churches we often have today. Sometimes the 19th century churches tend to go as well, and are replaced later on. Mass rocks then. Where do the mass rocks come from? A priest in the 1950s from somewhere in Ulster made a very sensible comment and said, the people that I spoke to in this parish said they brought a table out into the field or into the yard, and that's where Mass was said, which is very practical. And what happens when it's raining? Sometimes they go inside, and so the table is used wherever they can, and that's so. But I'm not suggesting that there's no mass rocks, because there's plenty of mass rocks around the place. So, but where did we get the story from By the way, there's the chapel in Ennis, tucked away, and you'll find that most of the penal era chapels were tucked away when they're in towns down the laneway. And that's sort of providing that deference to the Protestant state. Unlike in Emily, where it was cheek by jowl, Protestant church, Catholic church side by side, in most places they didn't want to test those boundaries. And so down the back lane. And you'll just see it there on the left, at the very end, still called Chapel Lane, even at the time called Chapel Lane. As you see there, built before 1714 and replaced in 1735. Ennis, of course, had the money. Now, this is Tipperary. This is Nina. Now, what do you notice about this photograph? It's from, I'll tell you the date, 1929. It's all male. Emancipation, 1829. They're commemorating 1920. It's 1929, and it's a mass rock site. We can't see this, can't see it, but the observation is they're all men. Now, are the women behind the photographer? That's my hope, but I don't think the women were there at all. And of course, pre-Vatican II, men and women were separated in churches anyway. But I'm curious as in 1929 why boys, young men and older men are there, and they're quite devout. There's a man, you see there's a couple of men kneeling in the front there. This was taken by an Irish independent photographer for the commemoration of 100 years of Catholic emancipation, 1829. Somewhere in Nina, at a mass rock site. But as we've seen in 1731 at least, there was a chapel, and there's probably a few chapels in the parishes around Nina. So where do we get, what is this site? And the explanation is for most of the mass rocks, some of the mass rocks in this area that you might know of, date from a much older period. They date from, some of them probably date from the 17th century. And why the 17th century? I've tried to suggest that they're not around here in 1731. I think 100 years before they might have been, sometimes mass being said outside in this diocese. In the 1640s, Ireland is in civil war. And when Cromwell comes, Cromwell always has to come into the story. When he comes in the 1650s, Cromwell is on a mission. Cromwell believes that Irish Catholics are the Antichrist because they have murdered thousands of Protestants, which was one part of the start of the war in 1641. He's arriving 10 years later, and he orders Catholic churches and chapels to close. And priests do go on the run. And there are indeed some, one or two, a handful of monks, mostly monks, I think, friars, who are martyred, who die having been caught. And it is the 1650s that is the real story of the mass rocks. If you're not living in Ulster. If you're living down here, I think it's the 1650s. If you're living up in Ulster, you're going to be living with mass rocks until as late as the 1860s. 1860s. Long after Catholic emancipation. Long after other chapels are built. Why? It's that old problem of there is no money to build the church. And even in 1860, and we know this from other sources, even when there is a church in the parish, some people continue to hear Mass outside because it's too long of a distance to go to the church. And they prefer, it is facilitated that Mass would be said outside, even as late as 1860, which was remarkable for me. So where do we get this vivid image? Where do our stories come from? Because the penal era is mostly the 18th century. We don't For all that Cromwell did, we tend not to associate him so much with the mass rocks, even though that's what I'm suggesting is the period that we should really be associating mass rocks and open air. That's when the chapels were closed could have been for 10 years. The chapels were closed, depended on the locality. It's the 19th century that the stories, that this image, the first image I showed you and this image I showed you are both 19th century, and they're both produced as Christmas supplements in a paper called the United Irishman, which was a Parnellite paper, Charles Stuart Parnell, in the 1880s. Now, what's happening in the 1880s? The Land War. And the Land War is being led by not only the people like Davitt and Parnell and others, but it's also being led by the priests. And remember the fall of Parnell. It was Parnell's difficulty over his relationship with Kitty O'Shea and the reluctance of the bishops in particular to support him after that came out, and indeed Gladstone. Gladstone didn't like not an extramarital affair, but having an affair with a divorcee. That brought Parnell down. But it's the priests were natural leaders of this time in the 19th century. And the first reference that I could get of the word mass rock, I couldn't find any word for mass rock in the 18th century. And I've gone through a fair amount of letters and sources for the 18th century. And even, of course, it wouldn't be used in English, so I even was looking out for the Irish word, Carrigonafran. The earliest reference I could find was the 1820s. 1820s. And it was not a political reference, not even a religious reference. It was an antiquarian going around writing about druidic and archaeological remains, like dolmens. You know a dolmen? Table tomb. And sometimes locals would give names, like I grew up with names like the Giant's Grave or the Witch's, Labby Cally, the Witch's Grave, or the Giant's Headstone, or the Giant's Seat or whatever. And I think that's what sometimes people are saying, oh, that's where Mass was said. Now, you can't say Mass on one of these big things, but they use the phrase Carrigonafran. The first actual reference to what we might associate as mass rocks came in the 1850s, after the famine. And not too far away from here, I think possibly even in Thurles, if I can get the reference, you get mostly priests giving speeches to a public meeting, usually a political meeting, so outside of the religious context. They created a story, and this is an example. 1867, Story of Ireland, a popular history. Intended for children, but widely read. In this book, The Story of Ireland, it referred to the age that gave to Irish topography what is called the Corrigonafran, the Mass Rock, found so thickly marked on every barony map in Ireland. It continued, this is what it said: what memories cling around each hallowed, moss-clad stone or rocky ledge, or in the deep recesses of some desolate glen, wherein for year after year the holy sacrifice was offered up in stealth and secrecy, the death penalty hanging over both the priest and the worshipper, and where not unfrequently the altar stone was wetted with the blood of the murdered priest, 5 pounds being on the head of the priest, as for that of the wolf. Now that history wasn't so good on dates. It just said penal times. And the clue to the 17th century is the wolf bit. Wolves became extinct in Ireland around about 1700. So it certainly couldn't be after that. Dates don't actually really matter so much, especially if you're giving a speech. The speech is you are trying to make a connection with the people that you're listening. And if you're trying to convince them that you should listen to me as the priest, then you have to draw from the past as if you can. In one of the speeches, in many of the speeches that are given, here it is. In Thurles, happily, in 1854, Reverend Father Daniel William Cahill, who was up the road there in Carlow College, spoke to 1,000 people at a rally in Thurles on the theme of the providential survival of Catholicism. Providential, it was God's will, stating that love preserved the faith in Ireland. And the crowd go, hear, hear. They agree with him. This is from the newspaper. And that while the mass rocks on the mountains and the confession caves in the valleys, you mightn't have heard of confession caves, so there will be convincing arguments that earth or men never took up the faith from any country while priests and people are united together. And that's the point. They couldn't separate and they couldn't break Catholicism in the past as long as priests and people remain united. And that's the story where that's really when the Mass Rock gets going, to facilitate this unity that is there, and it's a powerful unity between priests and people in the 19th into the 20th century, and is very successful. And that is why you get these images. It is reinforcing that message. And dates don't matter. You just have to paint the picture. And history doesn't matter. You just have to paint the picture. And it doesn't matter whether it happened in Cromwellian times or the penal era, just as long as you get a good story. And unfortunately, we now associate mass rocks with the wrong time period in the 18th century, when we should be associating them with a much earlier period, and probably from a shorter period of time. But so why do we want to continue to believe all of this? And this is nothing new, by the way. I'm not the first person to have said this. This history has been related in books since the 1960s. Lots of historians who were also priests and bishops have written about this. But it's not a story that we like to hear, I don't think. We like the romantic elements of it. And I'm going to finish on that point from Seamus Heaney, who says it much better than I can say it. Seamus Heaney is trying to capture what he has learned and the stories he has grown up with, and what he finds out, probably from attending a lecture or reading a book like you are doing. And he says this: more generally interesting and more significantly influential than exotic items, however, are those images and objects which signify common loyalties and are recognized as emblems of a symbolic past, which also claims to be the historical past. These emblems and objects guarantee our own way of feeling about ourselves as a group, and as such they have a potent influence upon our everyday attitudes. I can think of no more apt illustration in this context than the picture of a mass rock that used to hang in a neighbour's house. This was once a familiar sight, an oleograph of the outlawed priest in red vestments, raising the host in a secluded corner of the hills themselves shrouded in snow, the congregation in shawls and frieze coats huddled around on one knee under the frosty sky, and away on the horizon, a band of redcoats coming into view over a crest of drifted snow. In between, a man is running wild over the ditches to inform the congregation. In a way, nothing I have learned or ever could learn about the facts of the penal laws, what I have just tried to relate to you, in Ireland, could altogether displace the emotional drama of that picture. The 18th century past will remain some corner of my mind, technicolor, panicky, frosty, arrested in whites, greys and scarlets. And Seamus Heaney did a better job than I did. Anyway, thank you very much.